Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our weekly Q&A. My name is TJ. I'm a specialist in highly gifted education, and I'm on a mission to make gifted kids more happy, autonomous, and successful. Today is our 30th episode of our weekly Q&A. It's kind of crazy that time has flown so fast, and it's nice to see people coming in and still telling me that these are very, very useful, even if it's not possible for you to actually see them live and you're watching this on our YouTube channel. Today, I originally set out to do sort of like a rapid Q&A about different kinds of small questions, and then I went a little bit deep into some of the questions that were there. And I ended up landing on a few interesting studies from Malaysia specifically that I thought, hey, why don't I take that in? And then I ended up getting closer to a topic that is basically around scaffolding at home and how to help gifted kids with their emotional regulation. Because almost all the little questions that we had were about how do I help my gifted kids regulate their emotions at home? And therefore, I thought, why don't I make that the focus of today? So without further ado, I'll talk a bit about what the study was about and what they found out in it and how we could apply it in our parenting at home, specifically around gifted kids in Malaysia. So let's start with the thing that we're struggling with at home, right? So bright minds, quick thinkers, emotional and creative thinkers, big feelings. We spoke a lot about the 5 overexcitabilities that gifted kids run into. One of them being the psychomotor overexcitability, the need to constantly have to move around, touch things, even in order to have a normal conversation, basically needing to do something all the time, which is something that a lot of people that don't understand this need struggle with in school, but also at home. The emotional overexcitability, so the abilities that gifted kids have when it comes to understanding things and looking at minute details and feeling things more intensely, remembering things more intensely. All great things until we reach emotional challenges, right? Where the same stimuli are also a bit overbearing and making it hard for them to regulate. And then often being very good at avoiding these situations turns into less practice when it comes to emotions. Therefore, they struggle with it. And that manifests itself in what we call emotional overexcitability. Sensual overexcitabilities, smells, feel it, like touch is tough. A lot of gifted kids we work with struggle with tags in their shirts. Other things like not wanting to eat certain things more intensely than others, right? There's a lot of difficulties there when it comes to it, like overstimulation in terms of sound. So these sensory overexcitabilities are really tough for them as well. Then we have the imaginary overexcitabilities, which is all around my head is more interesting than the world outside, daydreaming, thinking about stuff, getting lost in thought, things like that is a very common thing that they struggle with as well. And then finally, the overexcitability. Oh, that's my son going. It's okay. He was doing some homework. So and the last overexcitability is the overexcitability towards intellectual need. So wanting to know more, wanting to learn more. One of the things that we tend to see is when they think fast, right? So the challenges when it comes to thinking fast and having these ideas around being creative. And being creative means doing things differently or combining things that are known in a new, unique way. And the need to solve problems, right? This seems like a good thing. But then again, as we mentioned, the feeling deeply, a lot of friction with, the parents or with siblings, you name it. And then on top of that, the need to want to do well. Now, sometimes we get kids to the point where they don't want to do well anymore. A lot of our teens sort of give up with the system. A lot of this has to do with the idea that they're trying to protect their ego. Like when we were talking a lot about Betts and Nyhart's about the kids that overadjust socially and underadjust socially, the kids that are not adjusting socially at all, so under adjusting, they tend to say, no, I don't want to do this anymore. But vast majority of gifted kids that we work with in our schools and with the parents that are here probably tonight, they actually have very high expectations of themselves. And we need to know that gifted kids at home, despite all the smartness that they have, the quick learning, the creativity that they show, they definitely need our help still, right? So we are there to help guide our kids, and that's what we all want to do as parents. But one thing that to realize that is that basically why gifted kids struggle so much with these overexcitabilities and the friction it causes with their academic pursuits is that they need challenge. Like the biggest concern gifted kids run into is that they're understimulated. And almost all the negative behaviors we see are a form of avoidance of this understimulation. And what goes wrong a lot at home is that parents do not provide enough challenge for the kids to deal with that understimulation even at home, right? So the goal here is not to remove challenges from them. It is actually to help them deal with challenges. And in order to do that, you need more of it, not less, right? So when you think about it from that perspective, it seems like, okay, well, let's make things harder. Let's just give them more stuff to do. And there's something interesting that happens in Malaysia where that thought is very much present. The term tiger parents has normally been floated around quite a lot. And unfortunately, there is some difficulties there too. And this is where we're going to get into the actual different kinds of parenting styles that exist and how they can have an impact on gifted kids in particular. It would be nice to put this in a matrix. So the matrix that we have here is we're looking at like warmth and emotional support. So how much do we help our kids with their feelings, their EQ? And we set that against structure and boundaries. So what are the rules at home? What are the requirements? What are the needs? Like, do they need to have good grades? Things like that, you name it. And then we go, of course, from 0 to a lot on both ends, right? So let's talk a bit about the neglectful, uninvolved type of parents out there, because they're actually obviously an important factor to all kids that suffer from well-being issues. But and it's luckily not that common in the schools that I work with, but they still exist. So this is no structure at all and no warmth or emotional support. And this often happens when parents are distracted, just not at home. Some of them like, literally don't care. But the idea being, it's like, well, you're on your own, you sort yourself out. Which is tough on kids, right? But like a lot of young kids particularly need a lot of modeling for them to learn. And with neglect and uninvolved parents, that doesn't happen, right? So very little connection. Parents don't really see these kids and no guidance. And as a result, whether the kids land on their feet or not is more or less despite the parent in involvement or uninvolvement, not because of it, right? So that's the one that we all try not to be. And for anybody that is here watching this video or like in this, it's obviously not in this particular bit here. Although phones, as you can see, can have a big impact on that. So keep in mind. Now, the other one that I want to talk about is permissive parenting. So permissive parenting is a lot of emotional support, sometimes so much that almost all of it gets reflected outwards. Spoiled kids is sometimes the term that is being thrown around. I don't necessarily think that that's always the case. Majority of the permissive parenting comes from a sense of love and wanting the kids to do well. But basically what happens is there is very little structure. The kids get to do what they want, or they get to act out the way that they need to. And parents normally either allow the kids to do it by saying, oh, it's fine, it's okay, or even go, to bat for these kids, saying, oh, the other kids need to be more mindful of what we can do. Or what they do to my child, and so on. So there's lots of comfort, not a lot of guidance on how the kids need to behave, right? So that is definitely a thing that is in permissive parenting. The actual focus is often on the outside factors and how they can be managed, and there's a lot of blame towards that too, right? So that is definitely one of the things that we have to be concerned about as parents. Little interesting tidbit here: when you have very strong permissive parenting to the point where all blame is put on outside factors, we see impacts on the kids in terms of, yeah, like real emotional damage. I know that sounds weird, but when we tell kids like, hey, the cause of all your problems is outside, right? Then we're taking agency and responsibility away from the kids, and it puts them into a massive fear state. So one of the things to be mindful of is that obviously the warmth and support is good. The lack of structure is what is kind of a problem, right? So let's look at the other one, the authoritarian bit here. So the authoritarian style of parenting is where we see a lot of tiger parenting, of course. So what we see is people say, I set the rules. This is what you follow. This is what is regarded as what is needed. There's, again, not a lot of agency and also not a lot of responsibility. When you talk about rules that you set and somebody doesn't agree with them, the assumption is often from parents that we've transferred responsibility to kids. And a lot of times I get parents telling me like, hey, like we have these rules at home and they're just not following them. They're not responsible. And funny enough, the way responsibility really works, and this is the same when you are in a company and you hire somebody to be a janitor, and then you tell them one day, you know what, here's the financial books for the whole year for the company. You have till tomorrow to finish it, and if you don't, you're in trouble, right? If you were to do that, you would go to jail for mismanagement, right? Because that janitor is not responsible for that particular bit of work, even if he would say yes, sure, to please you because he's worried, right? So like in that setting, it's very obvious that you can't just force responsibility on somebody. However, we are normally not very good at asking our kids, like, okay, what responsibilities do you want to take, right? So what are the rules that we have here? And this authoritarian style, though, is actually very common in Malaysia. And I'll talk a bit about why that is actually a bit of a cause of concern in the gifted and talented like scholar and academia, right? So Permata Pintar in particular does quite a lot of research on this, and a huge chunk of their latest articles have been around perfectionism, and it has to do with the fact that we see a lot of perfectionism, and there seems to be a correlation between authoritarian challenges and perfectionism there, right? So this is very low warmth, we say. So not, again, not a lot of support to help build up emotional responsibility and coping, but a lot of rules and boundaries of what is allowed to be done and what should be done specifically. And where this gets really tricky in Malaysia in particular is that we see a lot of parents not just set rules, but set quite vague, high expectations of what needs to happen, which is another really unfair thing for a lot of our kids, right? So, and you have to imagine that this actually applies to all kids. There's nothing really different here when it comes to like what kind of impacts you would have, or like indirect impacts you have on the kids when you do this kind of any of these three style of parenting. However, gifted kids just are more sensitive to the emotional fallout or punishment or consequences for it, because they're emotionally more likely to be triggered by things. And that's that asynchronous development challenge that a lot of gifted kids run into. So what should we work towards? Because ideally, right, like if we're all perfect parents, which nobody is, and people will have a tendency to fall back a little bit, but we want to be in what we call the authoritative style of leadership. So this is a at its peak, somewhere at the top here, of course. We're looking at potentially like nobody is there, like anybody that says they are lying. But like getting, and it's also not a real destination. Like this is a journey. You're dealing with living beings that have the mind of their own, and so your pathway will never be as straight anyway. So the point of all of it is the journey towards it, and saying that I want to be here is a fixed mindset kind of thinking. The idea is like, how can we improve ourselves at all times to move up towards more emotional support and warmth and more structure and boundaries, right, that are clear. Boundaries and structures by themselves are not a bad thing. But when we look at authoritative parenting, the idea with boundaries is that we agree on them, right? So it's a bit of a negotiation. What do you think you would want to commit to? Like, I have these boundaries. Within that, what would you want to do? And it's some really simple questions like, okay, I want to leave. Um, no later than 10 minutes. Do you need like 5 minutes or 10 minutes to leave? You'd be surprised how many of the kids, if they really feel comfortable and to say, oh, 5 minutes is enough. It still gives them agency. It's still within your boundaries of what you want to do, and it's a bit of a collaborative effort in a sense. And then because they have made a choice, now it is actually their responsibility, right? That's the beauty of this. And in positive discipline, the courses that we run, that's really big part of it. Can you introduce some form of choices within a correct kind of framework? And if you do that right, you start with a good foundation, like the ability to make choices. We just did over 30 assessments with kids that were classified as potentially gifted kids, and how many of them are so scared to make choices at all is scary to see sometimes. Some of them take minutes and without any help cannot take an actual choice, and that is as early as like kids that are 7, 8 years old, which is really worrisome, right? So like that is there. So they need a foundation, they need support, they need very clear boundaries that we scaffold. And it's a word that is going to come back in our session today a lot, because scaffolding is often used in education in general. So in classes, it's all about like having different levels of support that different kids can choose. Because when you look at the scaffold, there's little areas to it, and there you normally have to like climb a scaffold. So it's not like it's easy as just walking up. Particularly the ones that you see that are made out of bamboo. You don't see them as much anymore in Malaysia, but I used to go to Hong Kong a lot. They were extremely impressive, those kind of things. But yeah, so an idea of a scaffold is that it allows you to scale a building, and normally scaffolds are built while you're scaling them, right? So you can only really go to the next level if you do that. And that's the analogy that they're trying to use in this, right? So that's where we want to be, this parenting style, authoritative. So it might be an interesting question to you as a parent to ask yourself, like, where are you on this? But where do you see yourself, right? And there's quite a lot of science. There's like a source on here. If you go and zoom in a little bit on particularly the options that you have, there about like what kind of leadership styles there are and how important they are. Like this particular study that that I'm referring to is a Greek study. Greece at the moment is where the European Council of High Abilities conference was being held a couple of months ago. So there's quite a lot of gifted and talented work being done in Greece as well, which is really nice to see. But this is a this is some work done where like over 22 studies on parenting styles and the impact on gifted kids was analyzed. And funny enough, a Malaysian bit of work was in there too, which I thought was very interesting to see. Right, so it's encouraging that we're getting a little bit more support from the universities on meaningful bits of research as well. Right, so where are you? And then a question that you could ask yourself is like, what things are stopping me from getting higher up there? Right, and this is a very personal question. There is lots of tips and things that you could look into. It's almost like a self-help kind of thing, but we are often very good at analyzing what things we've done or that we do that don't necessarily help us get somewhere. So look at this. Like, this is the thing here. You have full control over this, even though maybe the emotional states that we sometimes are in are stopping us from doing this. But technically, this is a skill. This is not, to me, this is not how you're born, right? And you have a choice to figure out like how to get closer to that nirvana, essentially. So that is the idea. But what was so interesting in this study, and I'll go into that a little bit more, is that actually what they observed in Malaysia, and what we've been observing in Malaysia a lot, is that perfectionism is a real problem. And online, perfectionism is sometimes lauded as something very good. And in this particular study, in order to keep with that language, they're talking about healthy, normal perfectionism. I'm going to challenge that a little bit. Like, I've put it in here because that's what the study talks about. But I think healthy perfectionism doesn't really exist. Right? Perfectionism on its own is not a good thing. But there is what we call growth mindset, right? So if you have growth mindset, this is a bit thick. Let me just make that a little bit smaller. There you go. So growth mindset. And growth mindset is the pursuit of constant self-improvement. And that is slightly different than perfectionism. Perfectionism is basically looking at the intended outcome for something, whereas growth mindset is about looking at, like, okay, how much effort am I putting in and can I make that better? And effort is also normally supposed to be guided. So growth mindset, it's all about, can I learn more? Can I do more? And that isn't always just trying to get something perfect at all. And growth mindset actually celebrates when you don't get something right. Because when you don't get something right, you can learn from it quite well. If you're willing to reflect and if you're willing to sort of say, oh, yeah, like there's things I don't know, there's things I can do better. And when we work with gifted kids, this is a really important bit, right? But what the dysfunctional neurotic perfectionism, what we're trying to see, that is really difficult. So what is the difference between the two? So when I look at growth mindset, which again is sort of here, we look for healthy striving. Striving being the operative word doesn't mean succeeding at it straight away. It does mean you can have high standards, right? So having high standards that haven't been achieved yet is actually almost like a goal in itself, isn't it? So I have a very high standard. I want to do well, and I if that standard is high enough, I will never really achieve it, which means I have to work at it. Whereas the harmful pressure part, the other step, which is a high standard, it's still there. But in this case, it gets added with fear and criticism, right? Now, when we look at it from a parenting perspective, we should have high standards with warmth and guidance, right? So that means you don't achieve your high standard, that's okay. Are you feeling fine? Are you ready to try again? Like, do you need help reflecting? Whatever that is, that's the guidance part, right? And fear and criticism is like being scared. Like, if I'm not going to do this, I'm going to fail. It's going to be the worst thing ever. I'll have a story shortly after this about a particular girl that probably will get you thinking a bit about this, how far this can go, right? So what I like here is the little note that says, and this is the thing that you need to say as a parent, it's great to see you focus. Be constructive about the things you observe with your kids and then celebrate the behavior, not the outcome. That's in essence the only thing that you need to do to create growth mindset. And then as long as you're consistent with it, you will see that growth, right? So what that triggers normally is you get satisfaction after effort. And effort is very simply put a choice you can always choose to put in. Effort is something you can put in. Success is never guaranteed, but effort can be. And statistically speaking, as long as you put in more effort than most people around you, eventually you will succeed in comparison to anybody else doing things. But the irony is when you get to a point where you only like the effort, you stop caring about the actual results. And there was a moment where I saw this with my own daughter that what I was extremely happy with. See, my daughter loves drawing. Draws all the time, doodles all the time, figures out new ways to draw. And whenever, like, the happiest she is when we walk into a little stationery shop and there's like a new kind of pen or color that she could buy. Like, and she would be very like, okay, can I just get one? I want to try this. That would make her happy. And she would draw things and really enjoy that. One thing that she ran into that was a bit of a struggle at some point is she was doing to Chinese art, like the watercoloring, and her teacher sort of got upset with her not doing the things right, and she immediately decided, I don't want to do this anymore. It's like, okay, like this is not for me. I'm out. Even though she was asked to join competitions and so on, she was like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. So I had to sit down with her and encourage her to keep going, make her understand that the aim of joining a class like this for me, for her, is just to learn the skill. Whether that looks great or not, whether she joins in a competition or not, is her choice. And she said, okay, I'll fine. And she kept drawing. And one day she walked in and she ran into one of the A level art teachers that I worked with. And I asked her, say, can you have a look at like how she's doing, right? Like, what do you think of how she's working? And she came in, and my daughter had all her drawings sort of crumpled and not really tucked nicely away. She just had like a bunch of them like in a pile. And then the teacher was like, "Oh, this is really nice. You should put this nice. This is good for your portfolio." And went straight into a bit of teacher mode. And my daughter just went, "I don't care about all that stuff." Like she says, I'm still working this out. This is still things that I need to learn. I think I can do better with this. Right. So when you get kids to that kind of striving, you'll see them grow faster and faster and faster with it. And I think at a certain point when she does need to show something, there'll be bits in there that people will accept as nice things without her going, oh, this is perfectionism I can't do anything with. So that is a type of perfectionism as well. That's why they call it the healthy, normal perfectionism, but I would call it a healthy growth mindset. Right. So, and then the opposite is the harmful pressure, as we mentioned. However, what was interesting in this study is that they had like 448 gifted students, which I know doesn't sound like a lot of students, but gifted kids are rare to find. So as far as studies are concerned, this is actually quite a big group of kids. So that is quite a nice study to see. And what they found is that there was a direct correlation between the parenting style and the actual perfectionism levels in these kids. And they found that the predominant parenting style that would cause dysfunctional neurotic perfectionism was authoritarian parenting. So that is, if you just go back, that is this style of parenting caused this style of perfectionism. And they saw that the authoritative, sorry, let's say it correctly, style was mostly present for this healthy. And there's a very direct correlation. And then the permissive parenting was basically in the non-perfectionistic styles. Like that's where we normally saw that. But basically, what that means is that as a parent, we have quite a lot of impact on what kind of perfectionism we encourage within our kids. And that's the kind of impact you do have as a parent. Now, that's not all doom and gloom. Like, again, if it is your fault, you can do something about it, which is, to me, much better than basically saying, oh, this is just nature of the kids. I can't do anything about it at all. And one thing that is important with this is that with gifted kids, these shifts happen quite quick, and you can repair them. And that does take a little bit of friction, but then once that friction is overcome, normally we can help correct these kids quite easily again. Right. So what it is like they say, okay, authoritative parenting is very positive. You have to be mindful that you try to strive towards that particular style of thinking, and then stay away from being a tiger mom, effectively, or dad. What they in this situation. So what could you do to increase your warmth and give more agency and responsibility? But yeah, the permissive parenting was not a very strong indicator in this, and the neglective neither in that role. So what is happening, what they noticed in the study as well, is that the pressure created by parents could make the approval feel conditional, which also turns kids into a very extrinsically motivated kid. And that's the thing that we see in our assessments as well. We do some we have some ways, like with games and other things, and how we talk to the kids to find out whether they're extrinsically or intrinsically motivated. And unfortunately, a huge chunk of them are extrinsically motivated. And that's a problem because when the extrinsic motivation source leaves, then there is no motivation to do things. And that is not a good thing if you want kids to be self-sufficient. Again, growth mindset is about doing all these things from an intrinsic need to want to do better, right? So that is really important, like the conditional feelings that kids get from being pressured, right? So, and then another thing that happens is that making mistakes starts feeling unsafe. That's slightly different than just perfectionism. Perfectionism is technically a symptom of being worried to make mistakes, but we sometimes also see it being a way to deflect from other topics and skills that they are worried they can't do, right? Fixed mindset studies from Carol Dweck showed that if you tell people like you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, in a very quick set of time frame, you would get people to stop doing more tests because the next test could prove that they're no longer smart. So there is no benefit there, and that response is so strong that years later we still see the effects with these kids, right? And that's really something to keep in mind. So this is all linked to this. And then the behavior you tend to see is that kids stop asking for help. So I urge parents to think, when is the last time kids came to you to ask you for help? Which is different than you sitting them down next to them and saying, oh, how can I help you? Or have you challenged them on the idea that things were wrong, right? So that is another way of looking at that. But are they doing it by themselves? And if the answer is no, then it's very likely you might need to figure out a little bit on how to build up that trust with them. All right. So keep in mind, I'm not saying that high standards are a problem. You should have high standards, and anybody should, right? Like growth mindset is about continuously making yourself better at something. And we want our kids, we want our students to have high standards of themselves. So that's not the problem. But injecting the fear, taking away the agency and taking away the responsibility as a result, right? That is what causes the real fear. And that leads to perfectionism. So that's a big challenge that we have to overcome as parents. Right. So this is another analogy that I really like to use. I think the idea here is quite easy to understand, and it might reframe a little bit of your own parenting. Now, if you actually are a parent that you feel, yeah, and actually I'm doing fine with this, then I think helping understand like the differences between the two, whenever other parents challenge you on how you raise your kids, or if you see friends and family around you that are struggling with this, being able to explain what things work in your setting and basically paying that kind of positivity forward, I think is a good thing. Right. So the idea being the scaffolding that we just spoke about. Now, in this context, scaffolding is slightly different, but it's still similar in nature enough that we can use the same analogy. And then we have the greenhouse, the idea. And the way I actually look at this is that the greenhouse being a confined space where we try to increase the temperature of the environment to help things grow quicker, right? Seems like a good thing. But like if you're in a greenhouse, and whoever's been in a greenhouse for a while, it's quite uncomfortable. It's kind of frustrating, to be honest, right? So so if you're putting plants in there, great. You put a living being inside a greenhouse, they get very frustrated, right? And that, but it is kind of safe, like there's no, like you can shelter from the rain, you can shelter from other things. There's lots of resources inside a greenhouse, generally speaking. So like it seems like a good place. And I think when kids are very young, then a greenhouse, a place where you control the environment 100%, is probably fair, right? Because little kids need, like a baby specifically, needs an effective greenhouse to survive and thrive, right? So there's definitely an element of what you do, but you keep a tree inside a greenhouse, it is never going to grow as big as it could, right? That's basically where that sits. So a greenhouse, in a sense, at a certain time, it represents overprotection for us. It removes struggle, it removes outside factors, solves way too much, and this is a big thing about when we talk about introducing more challenge to gifted kids. It takes away discomfort. That's not a good thing. School's job is to provide sensible discomfort at the right kind of time. One of the challenges with schools is that happens without enough agency most of the time, particularly because gifted kids have less struggles with most of the curriculum materials, so therefore they feel very understimulated. But like that protection is at some point not a good thing. Kids need to deal with the emotional fallout of struggling with stuff. And like even as young as a baby, tummy time, for example, is a good thing. It teaches them to stretch their neck and so on. But it creates discomfort for kids as well. So some parents don't do the tummy time because kids struggle with it, and as a result, kids there's actually like some evidence that kids nowadays hit their milestones at later times. And gifted kids, of course, often are very much faster than most other kids. But a lot of, particularly in the West, this is more so in the West than it is in the East. A lot of kids hit milestones later. They walk later. They seem to be a little bit weaker in a lot of ways. I've seen a lot of the kids here nowadays, even like their bones deform a little bit differently. I have a feeling it has to do with the iPads, but who knows? But yeah, so discomfort is an important part of that growth process, and particularly with gifted kids because they're so good at avoiding discomfort because they speak fast, they learn how to read fast, they skip stages when it comes to learning. That they actually need more, not less, struggle, right? So that's in this context a bad thing. So what does scaffolding look like? Well, scaffolding supports growth because we talk about feelings, right? So scaffolding in this particular context is about understanding why emotions happen and what different emotions are. There's so many different emotions that you could apply to a situation. The English language in particular is really good at this. The Dutch language, not so much. Like there's a ton of words in English that have a lot of meanings, which is why old plays and stuff can have like such a nice ring to it. And to be honest, like particularly like the Chinese language has a very good way of expressing emotions as well, which I think we could lean a little bit more into. But you find that a lot of people are very bad at explaining what feelings are and what triggers them. And is it a lingering feeling, or is it something that is about something that's going to happen in the future? Is it applied to myself or to somebody else? There's lots of nuances there. And if you just say, oh, I'm just angry, then you're not really looking deeper into what either triggered it, right? Which then means or how to overcome it. And that's the kind of the thing. Like I always tell the kids and a lot of parents as well, the emotional state that you run into is not your fault. But the trigger and the response are your responsibility. You can change those. You just have to understand what triggered it. That means avoiding or making sure that the trigger can't happen again. And then the response is same as that. It's like, okay, how do I calm down? How do I, what are correct responses in these situations? And that's practice. And that's actually how emotional maturity happens with everybody. It's why older people tend to be really good in emotional stuff. And we say, oh, it's because they care less. No, it's because they've gone through enough stuff to realize like what works and what doesn't work. And we judge our kids often on the idea that they should know how this works because it feels natural to us. A lot of times as parents, we've not actively thought about why emotions work the way they do, why triggers do the things that they do to us, and what actual emotional responses you wish to choose to take. There's things that are told to us like that's normal, you should do this. But again, if you're just told that this is how you should behave, it is not your own choice. And then therefore, I would argue it's still not their responsibility. And there's a lot of a difference when once we work with kids that have real big anger issues, like particularly some of our younger kids, like key stage 1, a lot of them come to us because they have a lot of emotional anger and frustration. It's not just limited to the boys. We had a really, really angry girl, young girl today, that it was very obvious that she was struggling to figure out what to do with this anger. And once you start explaining to kids, like, hey, this is what that is, this is where the feeling comes from, this is how you can describe it, this is how you can take your time, all of a sudden, it's you can see that they're like, oh, I can do something about it. And then what we do in the class is we give the kids some roles, right? So one of the things we do at the start of a class, we write things down like cleanliness, like clean up the tables, make sure you, but also volume control, being kind to each other, things like that. So there's a lot of stuff on that board where we say, okay, somebody in the class is responsible. Who wants to do this week? And some of the kids with real emotional difficulty, by telling them you're responsible today, or asking them who wants to be responsible, and then often they will stand up and say, yeah, I want to try it this time. You can see a shift the first time they do this, and they get more confident and stuff. And you can do this at home, right? So you can make some of your kids responsible for some of the behaviors that you want everyone to see. And it's very likely that sometimes, without you realizing it, you're modeling the wrong kind of behavior in front of the kids. Including swearing and all that kind of stuff, for example. So there's definitely opportunities there to learn from your own kids, or to give them the responsibility to collectively work on this. Makes it a much more fun and collaborative thing. Now, and that on its own is actually a difficult process for a lot of the parents that we work with. So, like, showing that you're a bit vulnerable, that you don't always know exactly how to do this, even if you do, like, just pretending you don't can actually help, with particularly very young kids. And as kids get older and more mature, they will know when you're just putting up a show or not. But you'd be surprised how much more of a bond and connection you can build with your teen if you can actually agree on, like, what you guys feel are the feelings called, or what are the triggers that are there. In order to make that happen, this is kind of a metacognition way of looking at stuff. So we call it executive functioning. If you have a thing that is really, really, really hard to do, the best way to deal with it is to break it down in as smaller chunks as you can until you get to something actionable. And that is very important with things that are sometimes hard, that we sometimes describe as like traits. So somebody can be charismatic, somebody can be like, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, oh, he's charismatic. Well, he smiles a lot, takes care of himself. He listens to people. He asks questions. He's attentive. As like things like that. Now, so okay, attentive. What does that mean? Well, it means that, like, he tries to speak to every person in the room at least for a bit. Okay. Right. So that is actionable. Like, if you go somewhere, have you done that? Now, you can break any one of those behaviors down with your kids. So that is also a part of scaffolding. And it could be kind of a fun bit. Say, okay, well, like, how are you going to do it? Like, how would you break this down? How would you teach me this? And you'll be surprised how much they want to show you. My youngest boy was trying to show me some stuff on the iPad that I could do as well. Like I didn't ask him to, but he wanted to. So the sharing becomes a lot more interesting that way. The idea being is that you need to feel like you're close. You need to feel like you're emotionally there, for sure. And then you need to step back and let people do things. I was observing the class from Miss Fatia today, and there was this moment that the kids were working on this thing we call the values cave. It's a replacement for how we do rules in the classroom. So we don't have rules, we have values. The kids choose their values. That are linked to their own class rules that they set. So the idea being is that, like, rules tend to have sometimes a limited lifespan. People will break them. When you start a rule chain, you keep getting rules and rules and rules. You need guidance, as I said, but values are much more important, because if you have a value, then it's like you can feel when you break a value or not. And when you ask the kids, like, have you ever gotten into trouble even though you didn't break a rule? And say, yeah, that's what it is. Well, that's a value, right? So what are your values? And then what we do is we have like a cave with monsters that are representations of things that break values. And they had to make this as a little bit of an art project, and they've been making monsters and so on. They used Phil to make it all work. And with this particular young group, because it's the year 2s and 3s, it's been a struggle to get them to work together. It's hard to work together. For the young kids, it's really tough. Most of the work that they get is like everybody gets to do the same thing, and it looks lovely, but it's not everybody doing their own thing. And there was a moment where you could just see like Fatia was in the group initially explaining everything quite close, like this is how you handle scissors, this is what we do with the glue and stuff like that. And then the kids were all around her, and then all of a sudden all the kids went and did their thing. And I noticed Fatia just standing there and smiling for a bit, because none of the kids were looking at her anymore. They were just working on their own. Like, they were confident, they were helping each other. There was still moments where we had to make sure that kids didn't accidentally cut each other's hair, because it is funny to see how that can go with some of these young kids. But in a sense, like, there was moments where the kids were just working on their own. And it's when that happens and the classroom becomes a little bit calm and quiet, it is really nice to see, because you know that the kids are growing, even though they're just making what at its face value just looks like a relatively simple art project, right? But to them, it was really important, and they learned a lot from it, because they were confident, they were telling each other what to do, and you can do this at home as well, right? So it's like, you support, don't do it for them. Don't try to take that bit away. So yeah. All right. So again, a greenhouse says, I'm removing struggle. A scaffold says, I help you deal with struggle. And that's the important part. Then the idea is that eventually, when they go on this big road towards their whatever universities or their future life or whatever, you're no longer the shepherd that you were at that point. You hope to see them thrive and see them come back happy, right? So I think a big thing here is that you really shouldn't try to make their lives easy. Easy is boring. It's definitely not a way to help cope with the stuff that life can throw at you. So how can you make your kids more capable? That's basically the thing that I say, what can you do, right? So how do we do this at home? What is practical things that we can make sure that happens when we do this? So there's a few steps that I think are really important. And a lot of parents skip step number 1. And that is a shame, because this step number 1, the regulation and calm, is actually something a lot of us can use as adults too. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that life throws at you. There's thousands and one things that don't go well, right? So having a place at home that is your regulation and your center of calm is really important. Maybe you guys still remember Marie Kondo, I believe it was, like the one that always wanted to clean up stuff, and she was very adamant about how your bedroom, for example, should just be a place to sleep and nothing else, because if it is something else, it comes with a lot of difficult ways to control your emotions. It stops you sleeping well. There's lots of reasons why it's not a good thing. And there's this other idea in the army. They do this. Basically, the bedroom, the bed itself, is drilled into them to make it perfect. Absolutely perfect, make it a very hard task to make that perfect. But a big part of that is that the actual place where they come back is a safe and calm space where everything is in the place it needs to be, right? So you need to create a space at home where that can happen. I look at that as a physical and a mental thing, right? So what is the physical bit here? Is there a space that has things in its place where there's less sound? Is there like a nice place to sit? These kind of calm corners are quite common in SEN schools, like schools that have SEN facilities. What we have is the same at home. Is there a place where you could take a book and calm down and read? And if that doesn't exist, what could you do? And again, this is where you don't have to do this alone. Involve the rest of the house in this as well. And there can also be areas where you can have a little bit of self-help books on like how to meditate or center yourself or breathe. Interesting, calming fidget toys and so on. A lot of the kids that struggle with us when we start working with them that need some more extra support, we start with these pause routines, and they have very specific steps towards like, okay, first taking a step back, go to a place where you're away from any of the stimuli that might cause you distress, have a place to sit, make sure that you tell people around you that like you need some time for yourself so that you don't get disturbed in that particular time, and then ask yourself, okay, like what kind of activity could I do that get my head away from this? Some of our kids have like transformers that they transform. We have kids that fold origami. We have kids that just solve a prime number. There's lots of variations of this. And then finally, you have like a bit of breathing. So a lot of breathing techniques are really good. They help you remove carbon dioxide from your body, which has a negative impact on stress related stuff in your brain as well, right? So breathing is a really good thing, and whether you want to do qigong or other kind of stuff like that, that there's lots of ways to do it, and as long as you're breathing, it actually works quite well. And I want to say with this, if you think, yeah, I have a place like this and it's on the toilet, I would argue that probably that's not the right place to look for this yet, right? So maybe there's something else where you can do it, because that means only one person can use it at a time, right? So there we go. So that's the first thing. You need a place of emotional stability that also lives in your own mind, so that when the kids get into emotional distress, the first thing you can do is stay calm. Really important. You need to be able to stay calm. If you're going to let kids do things on their own, there is going to be a mess. There is going to be some fighting. There is going to be some struggle. That's part of it. Again, we want struggle. We don't want to remove it. And now that doesn't mean that if they make a mess, that you are the one who has to clean it up. That is the responsibility that comes with it. But stuff can be cleaned up. And as long as it doesn't kill anybody involved, everything can be potentially repaired, right? So then the question becomes like, what thing needs to come out of the actions that are there to justify that particular kind of mess, right? Because if one of the kids does something which, I don't know, blows up a computer, but he managed to create 500 bitcoins, you probably go, okay, I'll accept that. Like, let's fix the computer and then we move on, right? So, like, if you take something to that extreme, what is the thing there that needs to come out of it? What are the sensible boundaries? And that's and the more tools and practice that you have with them as early as possible, the less likely that we're talking about like long-term damage. But if you look on the mistakes is learning, this mess, all that stuff on the floor is okay. So what do you need to do is what your job here is not to teach them how to code, but making sure that there is stuff there that they could use to learn how to code. So what things are there that promotes learning, discovery, you name it. And that is all dependent on what age groups they are. The best way to figure out what it is that they need for this is actually just ask the kids. What would you want to have that learns something? And you could just ask them, say, okay, if I'm mom, I want this. Dad, I want this. So say, well, what are you going to learn from it? Oh, this. So okay, cool. Like, I'll get it, but you need to hit a certain level of practice. Like, you need to try, not just give up, right? And then make mistakes along the way, right? So again, if you have these things, if they get stuck, if they get, then you have to break it down into steps. If the thing that they do is too easy, that's the thing with gifted kids, you have to tell them to set a goal, get through it quickly, and help them with that. And then let them do it. Let them do the stuff, and you'll see them flourish. You'll see them learn. It's a lot more fun. Yeah, like it's one of those ways that you can get kids to grow. Because once they do this in a safe space in your house, eventually you're going to have to let them do it more and more outside. And one of the things that I tend to see, it's almost like a direct correlation between how many injuries we see in a school and how much creativity and learning happens in schools as well. There seems to be a direct correlation between that as well, because there's some schools I go to and everything is nice and neat and there's nothing like out of place. And then the kids are also all seem to be in all physical health. And there's some schools where everything is like it's a bit of a creative mess. There's a lot of confidence. The kids speak up. They say hi to everybody. They seem to be very comfortable. They're very happy. But there seems to be a lot more kids that need to use lifts and stuff because they have broken arms or twisted limbs or whatever. And I think that's a good thing, because it means kids are trying to step outside of their boundaries. And what that looks like inside your community is important. Now, one thing you can do, it's a little bit of a trick, is find people around you that have the same kind of mindset, that allow them to play outside of your direct sphere of influence as far as the kids are concerned. And as they get older and older, this is even more important. It harps back to the mentor session we did about a couple of weeks back. But basically, the Grove Garden is still within your sphere of control, like almost like a shepherd in a field. Your sheep are there. You're no longer controlling them, but like at one certain point, if they eat all the grass, so there's nothing left to learn, you might need to open the gate and let them go, right? So the healthy boundaries are clear limits. This is again why it's so important that you have to build a bit of trust, because if you need to get them to places where they're going to work on their own, the limits need to be set as early as possible, so that they trust that they have agency within, and they understand your limits, and they know, okay, within those limits, I can do what I need to do. And you'll find that they're a lot less likely to not listen to you. But to temper that, you need to come up with what I call calm consequences. If they misbehave or they make too big, like a mistake that has some consequences to it, let them run into the consequences. It's okay sometimes to fail. This is the biggest thing in our stuff when we work with our kids, when project-based learning, when we do problem-based learning in open style projects, it is sometimes possible that the kids are not going to finish things. And partly because they either overestimate what they can do, or there's some difficulties. We had one boy, literally, he was careless enough to take his entire project, leave it somewhere in the school, and now it's gone. He says it's stolen. I think it's probably somewhere else he hasn't looked yet. But the consequence is that he had to pivot and change his thing completely. And we never got angry, never got upset. He said, okay, what do you like? That's 4 weeks worth of work on. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to deal with it? And that's a problem that's going to come up sometime in his future. And it is his fault. And he never denied it was his fault. And he's upset. He was upset about it, but his actual new project is even better, I think. Right. So I think this is a skill that if he's going to work in the real workforce, he will be able to deal with and shine, basically. So that's the success factor that we look for at some point. I think, unless we have a few more questions in the chat, don't think so. I hope that this answered a lot of your smaller questions about emotional management and so on around giftedness. I thought it was really cool to show you that if you're trying to be less of a tiger parent, you should know that the science backs up that you will have more resilient, like healthy kids. So whatever you need to go on the journey, please take it. For those that want to see this particular more like this on our YouTube channel, we have a lot of videos where we talk about topics like this, and you can leave questions with us every week for this weekly Q&A. And with that, I'd like to thank you for all your attention and wish you all a very, very good night.